punch echoed through the emergency department like a gunshot. For one terrible second, the entire hospital seemed to freeze. The nurse stood beside the reception desk, one hand pressed against her cheek, her eyes lowered, saying nothing. Around her, doctors stopped moving, orderlies stared in disbelief, and frightened patients watched from their beds as the most powerful man in the hospital stood over her, breathing heavily with anger. But what the CEO didn't know was that the quiet nurse had spent years learning how to survive without asking anyone for help. And he certainly didn't know that, somewhere outside the hospital, people were already on their way for her. If you believe kindness still matters, that people deserve second chances, and that sometimes the quietest person in the room carries the strongest heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Because this story is about to remind us that you should never judge a person's strength by how loudly they speak. It was a stormy Thursday evening at St. Catherine Medical Center in Virginia. Just outside Washington, D.C., rain hammered against the glass walls of the emergency department, turning the parking lot into a mirror of flashing ambulance lights and dark clouds. The hospital was overflowing. 2 ambulances were waiting outside. Another was racing toward the entrance, and every available treatment room was occupied. In the middle of that chaos worked a nurse named Hannah Mercer. Hannah was 37 years old, with brown hair usually tied tightly behind her head, tired green eyes, and a calm expression that rarely changed no matter how difficult the shift became. She wasn't the loudest nurse in the department. She wasn't the one who demanded attention. She simply noticed things other people missed. She noticed when an elderly patient was pretending not to be afraid. She noticed when a frightened child needed someone to hold their hand. She noticed when a janitor had skipped lunch because the emergency room was too busy. And she noticed when someone was hurting even when they insisted they were fine. That evening, Hannah had already been working for nearly 11 hours when an unconscious man was rushed through the emergency doors. He was wearing civilian clothes, but there was something unusual about him. His hands were covered with old scars. His breathing was shallow. There was a small black medical identification bracelet around his wrist. Hannah immediately recognized the pattern. She had seen that bracelet before. Years earlier, she had worked in a military trauma unit. But she said nothing. She simply helped stabilize the patient. His name was Michael Grant. He was 42 years old and had been found unconscious inside a vehicle after an apparent accident. His blood pressure was dangerously low, and there were signs of internal bleeding. Hannah immediately requested emergency imaging and alerted the trauma surgeon. But before the patient could be transferred, hospital CEO Richard Caldwell entered the emergency department. Richard was 56, wealthy, polished, and accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. His tailored suit was always perfect, his expensive watch always visible, and his voice carried the kind of authority that made people step aside before he even asked. He had built St. Catherine Medical Center into one of the largest private hospitals in the region. But somewhere along the way, success had changed him. Richard had begun caring more about numbers than people, more about reputation than compassion, more about expensive patients than frightened ones. When he saw Hannah standing beside Michael's bed, his expression immediately hardened. He asked why a non-priority patient had been brought into a restricted trauma area. Hannah tried to explain that Michael's condition was critical and that moving him could be dangerous. Richard didn't listen. He was already angry because several wealthy donors were scheduled to tour the hospital that night, and the emergency department looked chaotic. He demanded that Michael be moved. Hannah refused. Not because she wanted to challenge the CEO. Not because she thought she was more important than him. She simply knew the man's condition was deteriorating. She quietly explained that if Michael was moved without stabilization, he might die. Richard's face became red with frustration. He accused her of ignoring hospital policy. Hannah remained silent. He stepped closer. The emergency department became strangely quiet. Then Richard raised his hand and struck her across the face. The sound was so sharp that even the patients nearby reacted. Hannah stumbled sideways. Her shoulder hit the wall. A young nurse named Rebecca Collins gasped. A doctor immediately stepped forward. An orderly froze in disbelief. Richard looked around as though expecting everyone to accept what had happened. But nobody moved. Hannah slowly straightened herself. Her cheek was already turning red. Her eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She didn't hit him back. She didn't scream. She simply looked at Michael's monitor. His heart rate was dropping. That was all she cared about. She returned to the patient's bedside and continued working. That was the moment everything changed. Because Rebecca had witnessed the entire incident. So had Dr. Thomas Bennett. And so had the security guard standing near the entrance. But none of them understood why Hannah remained so calm. They didn't know her history. They didn't know what she had sacrificed. Years earlier, Hannah had served as a combat medical specialist attached to a highly classified military rescue unit. She had worked in places where there were no clean operating rooms, no reliable electricity, and sometimes no way home. She had treated wounded soldiers under gunfire. She had carried injured people through burning buildings. She had once spent 13 hours treating survivors after an explosion while helicopters circled overhead. But when she returned to civilian life, she wanted something simple. She wanted to help people without carrying a weapon. She wanted a quiet life. She wanted to be a nurse. And most importantly, she wanted to forget the past. So she had buried every part of that former life. Her military records had been sealed. Her old colleagues had moved on. Her medals were locked inside a small wooden box at the back of her closet. Hannah never talked about them. Not even to the people closest to her. But Michael Grant wasn't an ordinary accident victim. As Hannah worked desperately to stabilize him, she noticed a scar beneath his collarbone. It was the same scar she remembered from years ago. Then she looked at the medical bracelet on his wrist. Her hands suddenly stopped. She recognized the coded marking. Michael had once been part of the same classified rescue program. He wasn't just another patient. He was one of the people Hannah had once saved. And somewhere deep inside her memory, she remembered his voice from a night she had tried desperately to forget. He had been trapped beneath a collapsed structure while enemy fire surrounded them. Hannah had refused to leave him. She had stayed behind long after everyone else had evacuated. She had carried him through smoke and debris until a helicopter finally reached them. Michael survived because she refused to give up. Now, years later, he was lying unconscious in front of her. And she was the one standing between him and death again. Hannah ordered the team to prepare for emergency surgery. Richard tried to stop her. But Dr. Bennett finally stepped forward. He told Richard that Hannah was right. For the first time, the CEO realized he had lost control of the room. Doctors began moving. Nurses followed Hannah's instructions. The trauma team rushed Michael toward surgery. Richard stood behind them, furious and embarrassed. Then the hospital's security radios suddenly erupted. A guard announced that an unidentified military helicopter was approaching the hospital. Everyone looked toward the windows. At first, they heard only the distant thumping. Then the sound became louder. Boom! 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 The entire building seemed to vibrate. Outside, through the rain, a dark helicopter appeared over the hospital parking lot. It wasn't a normal medical helicopter. It was matte black. No hospital markings. No visible civilian identification. The aircraft descended rapidly toward the emergency landing zone. People rushed toward the windows. Richard's face changed. The helicopter landed. Several heavily equipped operators jumped out. They moved quickly through the rain toward the emergency entrance. The security team attempted to stop them, but one of the men displayed an official identification card and gave a short command. The doors opened. 6 men entered the hospital. They weren't there for Richard. They weren't there for the hospital. They were there for Hannah. Richard looked confused. Then the lead officer walked directly toward the emergency department. His name was Captain Nathan Brooks. He looked at Hannah and immediately recognized her. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Nathan's eyes moved toward the red mark on her face. His expression changed. He asked what happened. Hannah tried to dismiss it. She said it didn't matter. But Rebecca stepped forward. She told him the truth. She told him the CEO had hit Hannah. The room went silent. Nathan looked at Richard. Then he looked back at Hannah. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten anyone. He simply told Richard that Hannah Mercer was one of the most decorated combat medical specialists their unit had ever worked with. Richard stared at him. He couldn't believe it. The quiet nurse he had just humiliated wasn't an ordinary employee. She had saved more lives under fire than he could possibly imagine. Nathan explained that Michael Grant was also former military personnel, and his medical emergency had triggered an old emergency protocol. When Michael's identity was confirmed, the system had automatically alerted members of his former unit. But there was another reason they had come. They had received a message from the hospital. A simple emergency code had been transmitted. Hannah had activated it without realizing it. Years ago, she had been taught that if she ever encountered one of her former teammates in a life-threatening situation, the emergency network would respond. She had pressed the wrong button during the chaos. Or perhaps, Nathan later suggested, some part of her remembered exactly what to do. Inside the operating room, Michael's condition suddenly worsened. His heart stopped. The team began resuscitation. Hannah stood beside the table. She refused to leave. She kept working. 1 minute passed. Then another. The monitor remained flat. Hannah's eyes filled with tears. She remembered the old battlefield. She remembered Michael trapped beneath concrete. She remembered promising him that she would not let him die. And once again, she refused to give up. She continued compressions while Dr. Bennett directed the team. Then the monitor changed. A tiny electrical signal appeared. Everyone froze. Another beat. Then another. Michael's heart began beating again. The room erupted into controlled movement. Hannah closed her eyes for 1 second. A single tear rolled down her cheek. Outside the operating room, Nathan lowered his head in relief. Rebecca stood beside him crying. Even Dr. Bennett wiped his eyes. Richard Caldwell watched from the hallway. For the first time in many years, the CEO seemed small. Not because someone had defeated him, but because he finally understood what he had failed to see. Hannah wasn't weak because she was quiet. She was quiet because she didn't need to prove her strength. The next morning, Richard entered Hannah's office. She was sitting alone near the window, holding a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. He stood silently for several seconds. Then he apologized. Not as a CEO, not as a man trying to protect his position, but as a human being who knew he had crossed a line that could never be justified. Hannah listened. She didn't immediately forgive him, and she didn't have to. Forgiveness, she knew, was not something another person could demand. Richard eventually resigned from his executive position after the hospital board reviewed the incident and his history of misconduct. But something unexpected happened afterward. Hannah was offered a leadership position in the emergency department. She almost refused. She had spent years trying to stay invisible. But Rebecca reminded her of something. There were hundreds of nurses who had been bullied into silence. There were young doctors afraid to speak up. There were patients who didn't know how to defend themselves. Maybe Hannah's greatest mission wasn't behind her. Maybe it was just beginning. She accepted the position. Months later, St. Catherine Medical Center created a new program honoring emergency workers who demonstrated extraordinary courage and compassion. The first recipient was Hannah Mercer. When she walked onto the stage, she didn't wear her old military uniform. She wore her simple blue nursing scrubs. The audience stood and applauded. Nathan Brooks was there. Rebecca was there. Dr. Bennett was there. And in the front row sat Michael Grant, now fully recovered. He stood slowly and applauded the loudest. Hannah looked around the room. For years, she had believed that strength meant surviving alone. Now she understood something different. Real strength wasn't always fighting back. Sometimes it was staying kind after someone had treated you cruelly. Sometimes it was protecting someone who couldn't protect themselves. Sometimes it was refusing to become the person who hurt you. And sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was finally allow others to stand beside them. If this story touched your heart, please support the video by liking it, sharing it with someone who believes in kindness, and subscribing to the channel. Your engagement helps stories like this reach people who may need the reminder that being quiet does not mean being weak, and being kind does not mean being powerless. And before we end, I want to ask you for something special. Comment kindness is strength if you believe that one act of compassion can change someone's entire life. Because somewhere tonight, there may be a nurse working an exhausting shift, a soldier carrying invisible memories, a patient afraid of tomorrow, or a person who has been treated unfairly but still chooses to be kind. They may never receive a helicopter. They may never receive a medal. They may never have hundreds of people standing to applaud them, but their courage still matters. Hannah eventually placed her old military medals in a glass case inside her office. Not because she wanted people to admire them. She placed them there for the young nurses who walked through her door. Whenever someone asked why she had never told anyone about her past, she would simply smile and say that the most important part of her story wasn't what she had done during war. It was what she chose to do after it. She chose healing. She chose compassion. She chose to save lives. And on the wall beside those medals, she placed a small handwritten sentence. Never mistake silence for weakness. Some of the strongest hearts simply don't need to make noise. And every morning, before entering the emergency department, Hannah would stop beneath those words, take a breath, and walk inside. Because the helicopter had come for her once. But from that day forward, she decided she would be the person who showed up for others.